Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast, your guide to help you manage life, money, and multiples. Each episode, host Paul Fenner, Tama Capital's president and founder, and the proud parent of 4 amazing children, including 1 set of triplets, will provide insights on successfully sustaining an active lifestyle, career, and family through comprehensive wealth management strategies, financial education, and lifestyle planning, specific to parents raising twins, triplets, and more. Learn more, subscribe to the show, or connect with Paul at tamacapital.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of TAMA may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Did you know that financial planning is more emotional than it is financial? That your cognitive biases help to shape your lifestyle and financial decisions? Today, I talked to Daniel Crosby, a psychologist and behavioral finance expert who wrote the book on investor and financial psychology that dovetails into our individual biases. In this conversation, I talked to Daniel, who's a New York Times bestselling author, The Behavioral Investor, where Daniel lays out the 4 consistent types of behavioral risk: ego, emotion, attention, and conservatism, which underpin our psychological makeup. We also discuss the impact that COVID has had on our cognitive ability to make decisions. Daniel talks about how his life transitioned from being a clinical psychologist who wanted to help people with eating disorders to being the chief behavioral officer for a financial company, a path that was heavily influenced by his father, who was also a financial advisor. Please enjoy my conversation with Daniel Crosby. I think the best place for us to start is your background and your story. Because when I first met you a few years ago at the FPA conference in Michigan, I wasn't aware of your background. So I think if you could walk our audience through that, how you were, you still are a trained psychologist, but walk us through like your story and background on how you went from doing that to what you're doing today in the behavioral economic space.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So you're right. I am a clinical psychologist by education. So my PhD is in clinical psychology. And so one of the things about behavioral finance is until recently, there has been no real clean path to a career in behavioral finance. So either you were, an economist or a financier who learned psychology, or you were a psychologist who learned the business side of things, the money side of things. And so, I pursued a degree in psychology because I wanted to help women with eating disorders, right? I got into this business because I had a friend with an eating disorder, and in the process of trying to help her recover, I got really immersed in clinical psychology and exploring treatment options and things like that. And I fell in love with it. So I got my undergrad in psychology. I started my PhD in psychology 3 days after I got my undergrad. So I was 23 years old at the time I started my PhD. And, about 3 years into a 5-year program, I just had kind of fallen out of love with clinical work. I was taking it home with me. Like, it was stressful. It was important work. It was meaningful work, but it was just kind of eating me up. And so I spoke with my father, who is, my sort of de facto career coach and obviously a great friend. And my dad is a financial advisor. And I was like, Dad, I love psychology. I love thinking about why people do the things that they do, but I don't necessarily love doing it in sort of a clinical setting. So, where else could I look? And he goes, well, son, there's a ton of psychology in my work. And I was like, what are you talking about? At the time I was like, you're a numbers guy. Like, you help people invest their money. What do you mean there's a ton of psychology in your work? But that was sort of the moment when I discovered the seed of behavioral finance, and we could take it from there. But that was sort of the moment where I pivoted from clinical work and started looking to apply this to the work of financial advisors.
I think that's been one of the biggest changes that I've seen over the last few years with our field is it's getting a bit more mainstream that financial advisors, wealth advisors, whatever, financial planners, there's so many different freaking names for us. That's part of the confusion out there, but that it's more psychological, more emotional than it is financial. It's easier to put together a wealth management plan for somebody, but the hard part is having them stick to it. And that's some of the things that we're going to get into, which is where your line of work focuses on, are all these biases and these emotional behaviors that drive financial decision making. Because that's the one thing I tell people all the time, and I primarily work with families, is that you can't necessarily separate your financial life from your emotional life. They are, directly tied together. And that's why I've been so excited about having you on the show to talk about, some of these behavioral biases and, what helps us make these financial decisions and what harms us when trying to make some of these financial decisions. So I think from that perspective, your work centers around, like I mentioned, a lot of these biases that affect or that go into making financial decisions. And I think that's the place that I would like to start and have you kind of talk about what these biases are and if people are aware of them or if they're not aware of them and how that plays into, making financial decisions.
Yeah. So the easiest way to think about a bias is that it's sort of a decisional shortcut. So one of the things that we know about the human brain is it's overtaxed. It's 2 to 3% of our body weight, but it accounts for like 20 to 25% of our metabolic spend in a given day. And so our brain is always kind of working harder than our body wants it to. And so one of the ways that we get around this is we rely on sort of shortcuts, emotional rules of thumb. And that's really what a bias is. It's sort of a stereotype or a heuristic or a cognitive shortcut that says, well, I'm just going to rely on this rule of thumb rather than thinking this all the way through. And so, that has some benefits. It has some benefits because it kind of allows us to move around without sort of having to ruminate on every single thing we think about. But the problem is the more stressed we get, right? So sort of the more taxed we get or the more emotion we get or the more stressed we get, the more reliant we become upon these biases. And sometimes we're not always working with a ton of good information and we become overly reliant on them. So I wanted to kind of set the stage a bit with just what a bias is, because we have sort of an unequivocally negative take on them almost. And really they facilitate a lot of like getting around. And I mean, honestly, a lot of them are good. It's like if we have an emotional shortcut for like, if a wild animal's running at you, you run the other way. Like you don't sit there, you don't sit there and go, like, let me calculate every variable. It's like, oh crap, run, and that's fine if we're in physical danger. But a lot of times they lead us astray, especially in situations where we have limited, sort of limited experience and limited know-how. And for most people, finance certainly fits that bill.
So that's a lot of the research that I've read, and I make it a point to read more and more behavioral finance work from yourself, like a Danny Kahneman, kind of what you just described, in Danny Kahneman's world is this system 1 and system 2. And so from that perspective, even though it's this whole thought process of evolution, that the way that we used to be hunters and gatherers is completely different than what we are today, where we have, desk jobs and that evolution hasn't necessarily come full circle with how we deal with, these biases. And I'm glad that you laid those out, because most people probably don't know what a bias even means. So from that perspective, what are some of the key biases that you've uncovered in your research that you focus on when it comes to making financial decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the sort of exploration and explication of biases has almost become a bias unto itself. Like they've really started to proliferate. We now have something like 200 documented biases, and it's not very helpful for you as a financial professional to, have a client walk through the door and say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, here's a list of 200 ways that you can screw this up, right? Like it's sort of an unwieldy amount of information.
Yeah, you're just overwhelmed.
Yeah, it is overwhelming. And so one of the things that I've done in my books is I've looked at this universe of 200 something biases, and I've really boiled them down to what I'll call meta biases. These are sort of meta constructs that that a lot of different biases load onto one sort of meta construct. So I've come up with 4. So here's my 4 sort of meta biases. The first is ego, which is just our tendency to be overconfident broadly. This takes us a couple of specific forms, right? We think we're better than other people is one shape that it takes. So all the research shows that, like, there's one great study that I cited in my book that shows a survey of 700 men. 95% of them thought they were friendlier than average. 100% of them thought they were funnier than average. 94% of them thought they were more athletic than average. Like, people just vastly overinflate their own sort of self-worth and their skills. The second piece of this is that we think we're luckier than average, right? So we think we're luckier than average. Like, so I think, I can look at other people and say, okay, what's the likelihood that Paul's going to get divorced? Well, I would say, well, national average says 50%. So Paul's got a 50-50 shot of getting divorced. Like, well, what about you, Daniel? What are the odds that you're going to get divorced? Like, me, never. Like, same thing with medical stuff, like same thing with cancer, whatever, right? Like we dramatically, we think we're luckier than other people. Like, we think other people are going to get cancer. We think other people are going to get divorced. We think other people are going to lose money in the stock market. And so, and then the third piece of this is that we think we're better at predicting the future than we are. So we think we're luckier than we actually are. We think we're more sort of aware of what the future is going to hold than we actually are. And we think we're, just better and more gifted than we actually are. So that's just one of the 4, but I'll shut up and let you.
No, you're good. You're on a roll. Like, that's one thing when I'm, having these conversations with people, I let people go. I try not to, interrupt at all, because I think you're the expert. That's why I want to have you on and talk to our audience and our families. So if I cover those, so ego, luckier than average, better at predicting the future. Was there a 4th one as well?
So there's 4 sort of meta biases. That's ego, emotion, attention, and conservatism. Last rate, I was talking all about ego, which has 3 parts, which is, better than average, luckier than average, smarter than average about the future.
Okay. So if we go from ego to emotional.
Yeah. So emotion is sort of just a broad tendency for us to, let our emotions influence the way that we assess risk and reward. So, if you're having a great day and I say, hey, Paul, tell me about your childhood, and you're having a great day. You go, oh, we used to always go to Lake Michigan and we would get this cabin and we would eat ice cream and mom and dad loved me very much, and you recollect the past through that rosy lens, right? If you're having a terrible day and I say, hey, Paul, tell me about your childhood, you go, well, I got picked last at kickball and I got stuffed in lockers or, whatever, right? It's this tendency of us to view the world from the emotional state that we're in. And people do this with markets too. If they're in a bad mood or if they're fearful about the markets, they see risk everywhere.
Does that align to like recency bias? Is that along those similar lines or?
Yeah. So what's interesting is recency bias. I would actually put that in my last bucket there, if you will, because recency bias is our tendency to think that what has been in the recent past is all that will ever be, right? So you ask people in, March of 2009, what do you think the market's going to do for the next, year? And people go, oh, it's going to continue to crash, right? Well, it was off like a rocket ship from there, of course, because it had been crashing and it mean reverted. You ask people now, like, what's the market going to do for the next year? And surveys have shown that people think the market's going to get about 15% a year for the next 10 years. I mean, nobody knows the future, but I'm going to go ahead and say that that's unlikely, just kind of given the run that we've had. So
yeah, I'm not planning on it either.
Yeah. So, recency bias is just this sort of conservative, if you will, tendency of people to think that what I see now is what will ever be. And again, this bias serves us well, right? Like if I meet and go, oh, I met Paul. Like I met Paul and like he was amiable and smart and kind. I'm not when I meet you again, right? Or when I meet you for a third time, I'm not going to go, oh, gee, I wonder what Paul's like. I wonder if Paul's going to be a total dummy and a jerk now, right? Like we think that what we know today is what will always be. And that serves us well with relationships. That serves us well in a lot of places, but it serves us poorly in the markets because we tend to think that markets will continue their current trajectory, when in fact markets tend to do, at least over the medium term, markets tend to do the opposite of what they've done most recently.
Okay, so far we've covered ego, emotion. The third one?
So attention is the third one. This is our tendency to confuse what we can recall with what is likely. So, we won't do this on your podcast, right? But if I ask you to, name all the words you could think of with the that start with the letter K, and say, okay, kangaroo, kite, whatever, you're kind of going through your list. And then I say, okay, Paul, give me all the words you can think of in which K is the third letter, right? And so you make a list and you're like, awkward, whatever, your list is. And so if you do this to folks, the list of words that begin with K is usually dramatically longer than the list of words in which K is the third letter. But in fact, there are 3 times as many words in which K is the third letter as there are words that start with K. And it's just sort of a function of our poor retrieval system that we think about the world that way. So what's a more practical example of this for markets, right? You ask people to think about the worst year of their investing life, and they'll be like, oh yeah, absolutely. Corona crisis, tech bubble, 2008, 2009. Like it's super burned into our memories. And you say, oh, tell me about a really good year you had. And it's basically all the other years between now and then, but our memory is just not as vivid for those things. And so it's a retrieval problem, right? Attention, right? Attention is this retrieval problem where we confuse what's easy to recall with what's likely. And if you think about like other risks in life, you ask people, how likely you are to die of a shark attack. And it's like, oh, that's a real threat, and you ask people like, how likely are you to die of something boring like diabetes? And they're like, probably not. And I mean, diabetes kills, 300 million% more people than shark attacks every year. It's just harder to recall. So attention is just this bias where what we can easily generate in our minds is perceived as being more likely as it actually is. because we're better at generating sort of doomsday scenarios.
I've seen so many infographs where it's got your chances of being eaten by a shark versus or dying from a shark attack versus dying from a mosquito.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a perfect example. Like I lived in Hawaii, like right after I got married. So now, 15 years ago now, right after we got married, we moved to Hawaii for a summer internship I had. And the first thing we did there was we got there, we were exhausted. We turned on our tiny 12-inch TV and we had like 3 channels. One of them was Discovery Channel. So we watched Shark Week, and it's like, it's like the most dangerous places for shark attacks. And 3 of them were in Hawaii. So we lived in Hawaii for this whole summer, and I never went in the water because I was so scared of sharks. 1 in 300 million chance, basically. And then that whole time, it's like I did a million other things, right? Like I took a shower every day. Like you're much more likely to slip and fall and die in the shower. I drove everywhere. That's super dangerous. I ate Taco Bell. That's the most dangerous thing of all. So we don't have a very natural gauge for how risky behavior is.
It's funny you mentioned those because I remember reading one of your books, and I think you put some of those stories in the behavioral investor book. I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
And I'll make sure that Daniel has written 2 great books, and I'll make sure that I put the links in the show notes for those as well. So we've covered ego, emotion, attention, and then what's the 4th?
So the 4th is conservatism.
Okay.
This is our tendency. We talked about recency bias as sort of a peripheral example of this. I think at its core, conservatism is about our preference for loss over gain, right? So we know that we're about 2.5 times as upset about a loss as we are happy about a comparably sized gain. I know you as an advisor probably get more calls when folks' portfolios are down 20% than you do, fruit baskets when they're up 20%. And that's just because, we have an asymmetrical preference for risk and reward. And it also has things to do with things like status quo bias, like we don't like change. It has to do with things like home bias. We see that where someone lives in the country has a lot to do with how they invest. So people who live in sort of in the Northeast tend to be overweight financials. People who live in the Midwest are often overweight agriculture and auto stocks. People who live in Atlanta, like I do, are overweight, UPS and Aflac and Coke and like all sort of the local businesses. So people are just sort of they're comfortable with what they know, and they're comfortable with what's around them, and they're not very comfortable with change. So that's all sort of the conservatism bias.
That's one of them. Last year was obviously really interesting with COVID, is that during the market meltdown in March, basically the month of March, I work with a little over 50 families now, and I didn't get one single call from a panicked family about the market, which on one hand I thought was great because it means I've done my job in trying to educate people on the ups and downs of the market, and people just realized what was going on. But you want to know the ironic thing, Daniel, is that when GameStop went crazy, I got more calls. I probably got about 6 calls about GameStop going crazy than I did anything else in my career. COVID, tech crash, great financial crisis, but GameStop and that whole frenzy, and it continues to go on. I got more calls about that. I'm like, everyone wanted to know what's going on with that. Should we be invested in this? I'm like, no, this is not a part of your plan. There's no way that I would invest in something like this, because if you look at the fundamentals of GameStop, and we won't go into the details of it. I mean, it's not a great company. It's just momentum has taken over, and people just get caught up in that frenzy. And to your point, just like when the markets are ripping higher, it's like it's going to last forever until it doesn't. And then it's like, oh, well, what happened?
Yeah, it's the GameStop thing. I didn't sleep a wink. I think that whole week that the GameStop thing was going on, I was just up all night looking at Reddit message boards. It was such a, it was for a guy who studies market psychology, that was like my Super Bowl. I mean, that was just the weirdest, that was the weirdest, craziest week. And it's still elevated. I mean, I think it started the year at like whatever, 15 or 20, and it's pushing 200.
Yeah.
Still. Which is sort of unbelievable to me.
Yeah, I can't get my arms around that, nor do I really want to, but it's been interesting to follow along with it. So one of the things I'm interested in is, and I don't know if you have an answer to this, but so we've talked about the biases, we've talked about investor psychology, but how has the last year of being in this global pandemic of COVID affected investor psychology? Is it are people more attuned to it, less attuned to it, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So there's I think a multi-part answer to it. So one of the things we know, I talked early on about how stress increases our reliance on bias. And so if you look at the mental health of the country and even the world, here in Atlanta, where I live, calls to suicide hotlines have been up 450% over the last year. And, the UK measured the incidence of anxiety and depression in its citizens, and they found that in England, it was up 400%. I mean, it's just, there's never been anything like this in the last 100 years in terms of the negative impact on people's mental health. And when you look at, when you look at the pillars of good mental health, the foremost among them is social connectedness. It's good relationships and strong relationships. And so when it becomes so difficult, and this is not me being critical of the lockdowns or the sort of the forced isolation, because I think a lot of it was necessary for medical reasons. But when we are so disconnected from each other, it's terrible. It's terrible for our psychology. And I think you've seen that reflected in markets. I mean, markets basically in the span of 1 year went from 1929 to 1999. I mean, we had the fastest bear market ever when people were, so upset. And then we had the fastest bull market ever. And now, I mean, valuations are very stretched almost anywhere you look, and even across the board. Like if you look at art, I'm a big baseball card collector, right? So baseball, collectibles are through the roof, art's through the roof, stocks are through the roof, real estate. And so, you've had a lot of people who are at home feeling bored, feeling emotional, and frankly, whose lives had been de-risked. Whose lives had been made, we were all kind of living in a bubble and sort of still are to some extent. And I think humankind has a propensity to take some risk, and you're seeing that risk taking emerge, like gambling's way up, sort of speculative behavior in the stock market. So yeah, absolutely, there's been a big impact. People are bored, people are stressed out, and their lives have been de-risked. Final point here, a lot of what you saw with GameStop was to me, people wanting to be a part of a collective. Like, we're all at home, we're all so lonely. And all the GameStop stuff was positioned as like a social movement, and it was like, hey, we're going to stick it, we're going to stick it to Wall Street. We're going to stick it to the bankers. Here we go, stack hands and let's go get this money. And the promise of A, getting rich, and B, doing it in a way with your internet buddies, that presses every button in human psychology, right? Like, you're gonna I'm gonna get rich, and I'm gonna stick it to Wall Street, and I'm gonna do it with my new buddies. That's catnip for investors, especially investors who are so lonely and so isolated. So yeah, I think this has been a huge, huge impact.
Do you think that as things get back to normal, those types of things, this is really interesting because I had not thought about this way. But if we get back to whatever the new normalcy is, however long that takes, hopefully sometime this year yet, and people are out and about, more socially active, do those things that they were involved with before, like increased gambling, increased, card collection. Like, we won't even get into NFTs. That's one question I keep getting asked about. What's this NFT? But as we get back to normal and we take risk, does risk come off the table? And then is there a potential that, all these inflated assets start coming down in price?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things I'd say. So first of all, there's always been investment chat rooms and message boards and groups. So some of this is like tale as old as time. Like, that's not going anywhere. People will always be interested in that. But will it have the same sort of emotional valence? Will it have the same sort of thrust and be such a big movement? I don't think so. Like, I think that as the world normalizes, people won't be looking for social connectedness in a message board trying to run up a stock with their buddies. They'll be at a bar trying to meet people. Like, I mean, doing what we always used to do. They'll be at a club or a bar or out with friends or, whatever. And so I think you'll see some of that abate. Like, if you talk about NFTs, and I know this is Pandora's box, like NFTs, the value of NFTs in aggregate has fallen 50% in the last 2 weeks or something. Like, I mean, there's no doubt to me that certain parts of the investment and trading world are massively, massively bubbly right now. Like, if you look at, if you look at this stuff, some of it is so out of control, like it's just unsustainable. So yes, like I do think things will normalize, but I don't want to cry wolf here either. There's parts of the market that are attractively priced, like international emerging markets value, some small cap value, all that stuff's like very much consistent with historical norms. But will people be paying $70 million for a JPEG piece of art? Like, I don't think so.
So one of the topics I want to come back to is, most of the time when I'm meeting with, husband and wife or partners, spouses, there's a difference between men and women when it comes to these investing and financial behavior right off the get-go. But then, everybody has a different look or feeling of saving versus investing versus spending. Have you done much work around the dynamics between, relationships when it comes to, and financial psychology and the differences between people within these relationships?
So talking about differences within a couple or a partnership in terms of financial differences?
Yes.
Yeah. So I actually created something. I won't spoil it all since it's not rolled out yet. But I did some research around what people fight about when they fight about money, basically. So we know that disagreements about money are at least ostensibly the number one cause of divorce in North America. And so I partnered with a former client of mine in Canada to create a survey of basically what do people fight about when they fight about money. And we created sort of a personality profile for couples that is sort of going to be the Myers-Briggs of financial values. And it's going to show, the members, the partners, like, okay, you think this about money, you think about this. So one example, this was the thing that we found that people fought about the most is money best used to seize the day or protect tomorrow, right? Is money best used for to enjoy the moment or to protect the future? Now, what you'll notice about this is that both things are important, right? Like, that was the case with all of things. Both things are important, and both things, if taken to extreme, are cancerous and bad for your relationship and just bad for your money. So what we're doing here is we're trying to measure couples' values around money, and we're trying to help them understand that it's not good or bad. It's about finding balance, right? Like
Right.
people, nobody wants to, nobody wants to eat ramen every day for lunch and hoard every penny they have and, sort of die with the biggest bank account and not have lived a life. And yet we know that people who who YOLO every penny away in pursuit of like living every day like it's their last aren't going to be ready for the future. So it's a big way that financial advisors can do good in the world, I think, is by helping couples understand their money types and helping them navigate them in a fruitful way.
That is really fascinating, because that's one area where I'm always cognizant of when I sit down with a new family and how they interact with each other and what their thoughts are on money. I like one of the common disagreements specifically is when there's kids involved is, okay, well, how do we fund college? Because typically most of the time I found that parents are on opposite ends of the spectrum on this, because you potentially had one parent that had to pay their way through and potentially another parent that, their parents paid the full bill. So one's thinking, well, I had to pay, then, I want my kids to pay. And the other parent's like, no, I didn't have to pay. I don't want my kids to endure this debt and whatnot. And so it's finding, I think you hit the nail on the head, finding common balance. It's not right or wrong. It's figuring out at the end of the day, how we can bridge that gap and make, the plan work and make our money work for the things that we want to do.
Yeah, it's great when the reason I like the Myers-Briggs analogy is because you think about something from like a Myers-Briggs type personality test. So extroversion versus introversion. It's not like there's a right answer. And yet people get so wound up in their personal experience that sometimes when an extrovert meets an introvert, they go, what's her problem? Why is she snobby? Like, why is she aloof? And the introvert's going like, why is this person all up in my space? And like, why are they talking over me? But when they understand that those are just preferences, right? That are partially shaped by who they are, partially shaped by their upbringing, they can go, oh, okay, she's not aloof. She's just a little shy and retiring or whatever. And they can go, oh, well, they're not so in your face. This is how they communicate. And so once we understand and articulate those preferences, we don't have to be controlled by them. And so we're all just doing the best. We're all just doing the best we can. And we all kind of grow up with money scripts. And like you said, my wife and I have this conversation all the time. Like my parents paid for all 8 years of my college. I got a PhD and came out with no debt. And her parents made her work for it. And so everybody, a fish doesn't know it's wet. We're all products of our financial environments, right? And then we come out and we just go, oh, this is the way the world works. And it takes really an articulation and discussion around those things as not being good or bad, but just being, different choices along life's path. Once you highlight those and articulate them, you can arrive at a solid middle ground.
So I know I only have you for a finite period of time. So there's a couple of questions I still want to get to. And I think one of them kind of encompasses a lot of what we've talked about so far, and that we've talked about these biases, and we talked about not overwhelming people. It's not like I'm going to sit down with a new family and list all these biases out, or talk to them about, recency bias, or, any of the biases that we've talked about, because you don't want to overwhelm them. Like, it's what I have found in my firm and doing this for a long time, and you've probably heard it from other advisors, is that it's hard enough for people to take the very first step to reach out to work with an advisor, especially when they've never worked with anybody before. I mean, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, you talk about emotions. There's a lot of emotions, going into that. So from that perspective, how do people gain some sense and awareness around maybe these biases they have and how it could help them?
So this is kind of the bad news. You mentioned Daniel Kahneman, right? So Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning psychologist, who's the father of much of this work that I've talked about today. When Daniel Kahneman is asked, in interviews, are you a more rational actor as a result of having studied this your whole life? He would say no. Right. And so the thing that we know is that, like, it's like diet and exercise, right? When I'm stressed out at the end of a long business trip, and like I'm tired and I miss my family, and I'm dragging my heavy bag through the airport, and I go eat a donut or something, right? Go eat the Cinnabon that smells so good in Terminal D. When you go do this, if someone were to interview me and go, "Hey, was this a nutritional choice that's consistent with your nutritional and fitness goals?" I would be like, "No," but like lay off, because like I know it's not right, but it felt right at the time. So knowing and doing are very different things in psychology. So there's really three things that we need, Paul, to get people to do the right thing. It's 3 E's. So the first is education, right? The first is knowing that Cinnabon is not good for you. And like, I think many of us have ticked that box, but it's the work of a good advisor to help educate his or her clients so that they're better informed. So that's sort of the foundational level. The second piece is the environment, right? So the second piece is the environment, which in the case of the investor is their portfolio. They need a portfolio that is volatility managed enough that they're not going to freak out at the first sign of a downturn. And so if you think about your clients, right? Your clients, you had clearly done a good job of educating them, right, about the sort of the realities of market volatility. You had put them in the right environment. You had them in good portfolios that were keeping them invested throughout the Corona crisis. The third one, though, is encouragement. And so that's where your clients kind of encounter the GameStop thing. They go, "Okay, what is this?" Like Paul prepared us for normal market volatility. Paul did not prepare us for a band of Redditors to send some stock to the moon. So like they call you and say, "Hey man, should we invest in this?" And you explain to them why they shouldn't. So that's the 3 things we need. We need this right base of education. We need the right water to swim in, which is the right environment or the right portfolio. But even when we have those things, there's going to be moments where we encounter something weird in the markets. There's going to be moments where we want to do the wrong thing. And that's where an advisor comes in with that encouragement and says, "Hey, now, nope, or yes," right? That's where they come in with that encouragement. So that's what it takes to change behavior. You got to have the right education, the right environment, and the right encouragement.
That was outstanding. that was outstanding. So I know that you have a family of your own and kids. I forget how old your kids are. But my closing question for all of my guests is, what is the best thing about being a parent?
Oh, I mean, being a parent has revolutionized, my family. So my family is actually gone today. They're off visiting. They're visiting my parents in North Alabama, where I grew up, and it's the first time I've been apart from them in 14 months. We've homeschooled our kids throughout the whole coronavirus, throughout the whole pandemic. So first time I've been with my wife and 3 kids in 14 months. And, they leave me this sweet note about how they'll miss me. And, the thing to me, the best part about having kids is seeing the world through new eyes. It's appreciating the beauty of nature in a way that only a kid can notice. It's falling back in love with baseball by teaching my son about it. It's falling in love with, the world by taking my daughter to Paris. Like seeing the world through new eyes, I think is the best thing about being a parent. A close second is the ubiquity of chocolate milk. Like we always have chocolate milk in our house. I couldn't justify that if it was just me. We always have chocolate milk, and that's really nice to be like, this is for the kids.
Well, Daniel, I think that's an excellent way to kind of wrap up our conversation. I can't thank you enough for being on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. I know you're a busy gentleman with a lot of career things going on right now, which we didn't get into, but we'll save that for our next conversation. Yeah,
man. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. Please visit tamacapital.com to subscribe to this podcast or to connect with certified financial planner and registered investment advisor Paul Fenner of Tama Capital. And please join us again next time on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast.